Hi, I'm Lola Odelola, and today I'm going to be talking to you about using storytelling techniques in your technical communication. But first, a little bit about me. I am a web developer advocate at Samsung Internet, and if you've never heard about Samsung Internet before, that's perfectly okay. We are an Android-based web browser and available on all Android platforms. Basically, you can get us in the Play Store, and we have features that are aimed at power users and people who are privacy aware, with things such as ad blocking and tracking prevention, which are both on by default. And we have a fully customizable interface so you can tweak things to your liking. I am also the co-chair of the W3C Developer Council. So let's get into things. Now, before we get a bit too deep, let's define something so that we're all on the same page, right? What is technical communication? Well, according to Wikipedia, they define technical communication as communication that is used to convey scientific, engineering, or otherwise technical information. And so if you have ever tried to learn how to code, you've engaged with technical communication. I think that's pretty obvious. If you've had to build furniture, you've probably engaged with technical communication. If you've had to read a manual of any kind, if you've read any technical blog posts or magazines or news articles, if you watched WWDC earlier this week, these are all examples of technical communication. So most of us have probably engaged with technical communication in some way, right? So what is storytelling then? Well, storytelling is the social and cultural activity of sharing stories. And I'm going to just pause right there for a moment because I think it's important to highlight that storytelling is cultural. And so our stories are informed by the culture we exist and live in, right? And so we have to be mindful of that, especially when we are telling stories in a culture that we are not a part of. We have to be mindful of what their cultural implications are for the things that we say. Like, how do they understand the things that we say? That's just a caveat that I wanted to put there. The definition goes on though. A story is an account of a series of related events or experiences, which is just to say, one thing happens which causes another thing, and then that other thing causes another thing, and it goes on and on and on until the end of the story. So in preparation for this talk, I really wanted to dive in and understand what the science of storytelling even is in the first instance, right? Like, why do we care so much about stories? Why do we enjoy stories so much? And I got three main points. I read a lot and I synthesized the benefits down to three things, right? Storytelling promotes increased recall. Stories are associated with better information recall and comprehension, which is to say, when you tell a story, you're more likely to remember it, and you're more likely to understand it as a listener, right? Like, the audience is more likely to remember it, and the audience is more likely to understand whatever information you're presenting if it's told in story form. Another thing is that stories increase empathy. Sharing stories creates bonds between a storyteller and a listener. And there's a really cool experiment that was done that emphasizes this, right? Scientists took a woman who speaks English and Russian, and they hooked her up to an MRI machine. And they took listeners, volunteers, who only understand English, and hooked them up to MRI machines. And as this woman told a story in English, their brains lit up in relation to her. So, for example, if she was at an exciting part of the story, their brains also lit up. As she was excited, they were excited in their brains, right? As she was afraid in her brain, they were afraid in their brain. As she was happy in her brain, they were happy in her brain. So there's this kind of like synergy, synchronization happening, right? But it only happened when she told the story in English. When she told the story in Russian, their brain activity did not have the same movement. It wasn't the same. There wasn't that synchronization. And what we can kind of gain from this is when you are able to experience the emotions of the person telling the story, when the audience is able to experience the emotion of the storyteller, that's a great avenue for empathy. That's a great way to build empathy between the two groups, right? And finally, stories enable meaning making. Stories usually give the context necessary for listeners and readers to form and understand meaning. And again, another great example of this would be fables, right? Fables which use story to kind of show or teach a lesson, to get usually aimed at children to understand bigger picture things, right? When we are able to understand the context that informs a main character's decision or informs a consequence of an action, we are able to make meaning, and often we are able to apply that meaning to our own real life situations. So why should we use storytelling in technical communication? Well, first and foremost, people are biased towards stories. When you think about it, a lot of the information you consume is done so through storytelling, whether that's through the news, whether that's through social media, or even listening to music, right? Storytelling is interwoven into just almost every fabric of our life. And a really interesting thing that I read was from Michael Dahlstrom in his paper, Using Narratives and Storytelling to Communicate Science with Non-Expert Audiences. That's a mouthful. But he says, non-experts get most of their science information from mass media content, which in itself is already biased towards narrative formats. Narratives are also intrinsically persuasive, which offers science communicators tactics for persuading otherwise resistant audiences. And I think a good example of when we saw this in action, in real life action, was during the beginning of the COVID pandemic, right? There was a lot of noise going on, but we know that with the science communicators and doctors came out and started sharing stories of people who had experienced COVID-19, what their symptoms were, how they felt. When we had families of people who had experienced COVID-19 come out and say how they saw it happening, and how they felt seeing a family member experience COVID-19, or how they felt experiencing COVID-19, we started to see a shift in just like the cultural understanding of things. That shift did not permeate through all facets of society, but we saw how storytelling was an important vehicle in getting people on board with the preventative measures needed to combat COVID-19. Stories also cut through information clutter. There is so much noise out there, especially in the age of the internet where everything is at our fingertips. And a good story engages audience from the get-go and cuts through all of that noise. So what storytelling techniques can we actually use in our technical communication? So the first thing we can do is mix narration with exposition. What do I mean by that? Well, a lot of technical communication uses exposition. This is this, that is that, and so on and so forth, right? When we mix narration, we add a nice layer of depth to our writing or to whatever communication we're creating. An example of this would be to use case studies. Using case studies written in first person where the writer says, I used this product and felt this way. That's a good way to mix narration in with exposition. Or I found this thing difficult and this is how I solved it. When you have a blog post that is written by someone who has encountered a problem and found a solution to that problem, they are usually using narration to explain how they came to a solution to their problem. Another thing to consider is to experiment with mediums. There are already so many brilliant creative technologists out there who are already doing this and who are branching out into comics, into animation, into YouTube videos, into podcasts, into so many different ways of communicating technical information, right? And it's really up to you to decide what medium does your communication best lend itself. It may not always be appropriate to have something that's solely in a written format. It may be more helpful to have a video and something written, or a comic and a video, or something written that addresses one thing and a podcast that expands on that thing. Mixing and experimenting with mediums is another way to engage users through storytelling. Finally, consider showing the consequences of actions. So something that's key to storytelling is conflict. And conflict is usually main character does something and the consequences of that thing are shown to the audience. That's what conflict is. Conflict without the consequences isn't conflict. And so we want to show what the consequences are of people either using our product or an operating system doing something that it shouldn't do, or just a product or system doing something that it shouldn't do. What happens? Show us. And don't just tell us, show us too. Whether that's through diagrams or through video, show us, demonstrate to us what happens. So those are my tips for implementing storytelling techniques in your technical communication. You can follow me on Twitter at Lola Odelola, and thank you very much for watching.